The conversation around Bitcoin and government control reached a critical inflection point in March 2025 when President Trump signed an executive order establishing what is officially called the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve. And while the mainstream narrative presents this as a simple custody arrangement for seized digital assets, the deeper implications reveal a geopolitical chess game that extends far beyond what most people understand about monetary sovereignty, asset control, and the future architecture of global finance. The executive order itself, titled Establishment of the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve and United States Digital Asset Stockpile, creates two distinct repositories within the Department of Treasury, one exclusively for Bitcoin and another for all other digital assets that have been forfeited through criminal or civil proceedings. And what makes this particularly significant is not just the formalization of these holdings, but the strategic prohibition against selling any Bitcoin deposited into this reserve, effectively treating it as a permanent store of value comparable to gold reserves held at Fort Knox. The United States government currently holds approximately 200,000 Bitcoin acquired through various law enforcement actions, seizures from criminal enterprises, and civil asset forfeiture cases. And at current valuations, this represents somewhere between $17 and $20 billion, depending on market fluctuations, making the US government one of the largest Bitcoin holders in the world, alongside major institutional investors and sovereign wealth funds. The origins of these holdings trace back to some of the most high-profile cryptocurrency seizures in history, including the Silk Road Marketplace shutdown, the Bitfinex hack recovery, and most recently a record-breaking $15 billion seizure connected to a Cambodian criminal enterprise called the Prince Group, which was involved in large-scale fraud operations, money laundering networks, and human trafficking schemes that forced workers into prison-like compounds to carry out cryptocurrency scams targeting American citizens. What David Sachs, the White House's crypto and AI czar, emphasized when announcing this reserve is that previous administrations made what he characterized as a costly mistake by selling seized Bitcoin prematurely, calculating that these early sales cost American taxpayers over $17 billion in unrealized value as Bitcoin's price appreciated over time. And this narrative positions the reserve not as an aggressive expansion of government power, but as a prudent fiscal decision to retain appreciating assets rather than liquidating them at potentially suboptimal prices. The executive order mandates that within 30 days, every federal agency must provide a complete accounting of all Bitcoin and digital assets in their possession, creating for the first time a comprehensive inventory of cryptocurrency holdings scattered across different departments, from the Justice Department to the Secret Service to the IRS. And this consolidation process transforms what was previously a fragmented collection of seized assets into a centralized strategic reserve administered by the Treasury Department, with clear custody protocols and management structures. The language of the order explicitly prohibits any incremental costs to taxpayers and requires that any future acquisition strategies be budget neutral, meaning that if the government were to expand its Bitcoin holdings beyond what already exists from forfeitures, those acquisitions would need to come from asset swaps, revenue generation, or other mechanisms that don't involve direct taxpayer expenditure. Though separate legislation called the Bitcoin Act introduced in Congress goes further by authorizing the Treasury Department to directly purchase up to 1 million Bitcoin, with the goal of eventually holding approximately 5% of the total Bitcoin supply, which would mirror the proportional size of US gold reserves relative to global gold stocks. This is where the geopolitical dimension becomes more visible, because establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve signals to other nations that the United States views cryptocurrency not as a speculative asset class or a fringe technology, but as a legitimate component of national economic security infrastructure comparable to petroleum reserves, rare earth minerals, or monetary gold. And this shift represents a complete reversal from previous regulatory approaches that treated cryptocurrency with skepticism and often hostility. The comparison that immediately comes to mind for anyone familiar with American economic history is Executive Order 6102, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, which prohibited the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion and gold certificates by private citizens and required them to surrender their gold holdings to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper currency at a fixed rate of $20.67 per troy ounce, with violations punishable by fines equivalent to over $200,000 in today's money and up to 10 years in prison. Roosevelt's order was designed to address the Great Depression by removing gold from private circulation, consolidating it under government control, and then devaluing the dollar against gold to provide monetary flexibility. And while the historical context was vastly different, the structural parallel raises legitimate questions about whether a future government could attempt something similar with Bitcoin, especially since cryptocurrency exchanges like Coinbase already share customer information with tax authorities through Know Your Customer requirements, creating a de facto registry of Bitcoin holders that could theoretically be accessed if political winds shifted toward confiscation. However, the crucial distinction is that Trump's executive order does not authorize, propose, or even hint at confiscation of privately held Bitcoin, and the reserve is explicitly capitalized only through assets already in government custody from criminal seizures, meaning Bitcoin taken from drug traffickers, ransomware operators, money launderers, fraud schemes, and other illicit operations, not from law-abiding citizens who purchase Bitcoin through legitimate exchanges or mine it themselves. The order actually goes in the opposite direction by emphasizing protection of fundamental blockchain activities, including self-custody, which is the practice of holding your own private keys rather than keeping Bitcoin on exchanges, as well as mining operations and permissionless transactions, all of which are explicitly supported under the broader digital asset policy framework that Trump established in a separate January 2025 executive order titled Strengthening American Leadership in Digital Financial Technology. That earlier order revoked previous policies viewed as hostile to the crypto industry, banned the establishment of a central bank digital currency, expressed support for dollar-backed stablecoins, and created a presidential working group on digital asset markets to evaluate regulatory frameworks, representing a comprehensive policy shift toward positioning the United States as what Trump called the crypto capital of the world. The strategic calculation behind this approach becomes clearer when you consider the international competition for cryptocurrency leadership, because while the United States was implementing restrictive policies under previous administrations, other nations were moving aggressively to establish themselves as crypto-friendly jurisdictions, from El Salvador adopting Bitcoin as legal tender, to Switzerland creating regulatory sandboxes for blockchain companies, to Singapore building comprehensive digital asset frameworks, and this brain drain of talent, capital, and innovation to other countries represented a long-term strategic risk that the Trump administration appears determined to reverse. The establishment of the strategic Bitcoin reserve serves multiple overlapping purposes in this context. First, as a signal to domestic and international markets that the US government considers Bitcoin valuable enough to hold as a reserve asset rather than liquidate. Second, as a mechanism to prevent future administrations from selling these holdings without significant procedural hurdles. And third, as a foundation for potential future expansion if Congress passes legislation like the Bitcoin Act that would authorize direct purchases to reach that 5% of total supply target. The question of why 5% specifically relates to the proportionality argument, because the United States holds approximately 8,000 metric tons of gold, which represents roughly 3% of all gold ever mined in human history, though some estimates put US gold reserves at a higher percentage when considering only above-ground refined gold available for monetary purposes rather than gold in jewelry, industrial applications, or inaccessible geological deposits. And the idea is that Bitcoin as a potential digital reserve asset should be held in comparable proportion to its total supply to maximize strategic influence over the asset class. This is not just about holding Bitcoin for price appreciation, though that's certainly part of the calculus given that the government's existing holdings have increased enormously in value since seizure, but more fundamentally about establishing a position in what many analysts view as an emerging parallel financial system that operates outside traditional banking infrastructure and could become increasingly important as digital payments, cross-border transactions, and decentralized finance continue to grow. The national security dimension appears most clearly in how the reserve is framed not as an investment vehicle, but as a strategic asset comparable to petroleum reserves maintained to ensure energy security during supply disruptions, or gold reserves held to back currency credibility and provide emergency liquidity. And this framing suggests that policymakers are considering scenarios where Bitcoin or digital assets more broadly could serve important functions during financial crises, currency instability, or geopolitical conflicts that disrupt traditional payment systems. The recent $15 billion Bitcoin seizure from the Prince Group illustrates both the scale of cryptocurrency's role in global crime and the practical challenges of managing such large holdings, because this single forfeiture represents more Bitcoin than many countries hold in their entire strategic reserves. And the connection to organized crime networks operating across Cambodia, China, and other Southeast Asian countries demonstrates how cryptocurrency has become embedded in transnational criminal infrastructure that costs American citizens billions of dollars annually through sophisticated fraud schemes. What makes this seizure particularly relevant to the strategic reserve discussion is that it demonstrates the government's capacity to identify, track, and ultimately confiscate large quantities of Bitcoin even when criminals attempt to obscure ownership through multiple wallets, mixing services, and complex transaction patterns, which both validates the reserve's strategy by showing that the government can effectively custody and manage Bitcoin at scale, and raises questions about privacy, surveillance, and the extent to which blockchain transparency enables government monitoring of cryptocurrency activity. The civil forfeiture mechanisms that feed the strategic reserve operate through legal processes that allow the government to seize assets connected to criminal activity, and while these processes have their own controversies around due process and potential abuse, they represent the exclusive source of Bitcoin for the reserve under current policy, meaning that the government would need to establish criminal or civil violations before taking custody of any cryptocurrency. This legal framework is important because it constrains the government's ability to simply decide to confiscate Bitcoin from ordinary holders, since such action would require either new legislation passed by Congress, a different executive order with explicit confiscation authority that would face immediate constitutional challenges, or a fundamental reinterpretation of existing asset forfeiture laws that would almost certainly be litigated extensively, and none of these paths would be politically simple given the millions of Americans who now hold cryptocurrency and the increasingly organized political influence of the crypto industry. The prohibition against selling Bitcoin from the reserve creates an interesting dynamic where the government's holdings will continue to grow through ongoing criminal seizures but cannot shrink through sales, meaning that over time the reserve will accumulate more Bitcoin as law enforcement actions continue to uncover cryptocurrency holdings connected to illegal activities. And this one-way valve transforms the government from a periodic seller that adds supply pressure to markets into a permanent holder that removes Bitcoin from circulation, which has implications for overall supply dynamics, given Bitcoin's fixed total supply of 21 million coins. The instruction for the Treasury and Commerce Secretaries to develop budget-neutral strategies for acquiring additional Bitcoin suggests that policymakers are thinking creatively about how to expand holdings without direct taxpayer funding, and potential mechanisms could include using revenue from tariffs, auctioning other seized assets like real estate or vehicles to purchase Bitcoin, accepting Bitcoin for certain government fees or fines, or engaging in asset swaps where the government exchanges other reserve assets for cryptocurrency, though none of these strategies have been publicly detailed yet. Critics of the strategic reserve raise several concerns, including conflicts of interest given that Trump and various administration officials have personal cryptocurrency holdings and business connections to the crypto industry, the lack of clear benefits to ordinary Americans from the government holding Bitcoin rather than selling it and using the proceeds for public services or deficit reduction, and the risk that elevating Bitcoin to reserve asset status could contribute to financial instability if the volatile cryptocurrency market experiences severe crashes that depreciate the value of government holdings. Congressman Jerry Connolly, ranking member of the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, specifically urged the Treasury Secretary to cease efforts to create the reserve, arguing that it provides no discernible benefit to the American people and raises serious questions about the appropriateness of government participation in highly speculative asset markets, though these objections have not prevented the implementation of the executive order. The international implications extend beyond simple competition for crypto industry leadership, because if the United States successfully establishes a large Bitcoin reserve and other major economies follow suit, this could fundamentally alter Bitcoin's role in the global financial system from a private speculative asset to something more resembling a reserve currency component that central banks and treasuries hold alongside traditional reserves of gold, foreign currencies, and special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund. Some countries have already begun exploring this path, with El Salvador being the most prominent example through its aggressive Bitcoin accumulation strategy and legal tender designation, though at a much smaller scale than what the US Reserve could eventually become, and other nations, including some Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds and Asian economies, have reportedly been accumulating cryptocurrency positions either directly or through state-controlled investment vehicles, creating a nascent competition for digital asset reserves that parallels historical competitions for gold reserves. The question of whether this represents a step toward Bitcoin replacing or supplementing the dollar as a global reserve currency is more complex because the dollar's dominance derives not just from the size of US gold or foreign exchange reserves, but from the depth and liquidity of dollar-denominated financial markets, the stability of American political and legal institutions, the network effects of existing dollar usage in trade and finance, and the military and diplomatic power that backs dollar hegemony, none of which Bitcoin currently replicates. Though proponents argue that over longer time horizons, Bitcoin's fixed supply and decentralized nature could become attractive attributes for reserve diversification, especially for countries seeking alternatives to dollar dominance. The practical mechanics of how the government custodies this Bitcoin involve sophisticated cryptographic security measures, where private keys that control access to the wallets are presumably held in secure facilities with multiple layers of physical and digital protection, analogous to how physical gold in Fort Knox is protected by armed guards, reinforced vaults, and restricted access protocols, though the specific custody arrangements for government Bitcoin holdings are not publicly disclosed in detail for security reasons. The creation of separate offices within the Treasury Department to administer the Bitcoin reserve and the broader digital asset stockpile suggests a professionalization of government cryptocurrency management, moving from ad hoc handling by individual agencies to centralized operations with specialized personnel, standardized procedures, and clear lines of authority, which matters both for security purposes to prevent theft or loss and for policy purposes to enable coordinated decision-making about how these assets fit into broader fiscal and monetary strategy. The broader digital asset stockpile that includes cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin raises additional questions because while Bitcoin has the longest track record, largest market capitalization, and strongest claim to being digital gold, other cryptocurrencies serve different functions, from Ethereum's smart contract platform to stablecoins that maintain dollar parity to various tokens with specific use cases, and determining which of these assets merit government custody versus which should be sold at auction requires policy judgments about their long-term viability, strategic value, and appropriate role in government holdings. Trump specifically mentioned 5 cryptocurrencies that would be included in the broader reserve, which were Bitcoin, XRP, Solana, Cardano, and another token. And the announcement of these specific selections caused immediate market reactions, with each asset experiencing price increases, illustrating how government actions in the cryptocurrency space now have substantial market-moving power that creates both opportunities and risks depending on how that power is wielded. The deadline that passed for the Treasury Secretary to report on implementation details suggests that behind the scenes there is substantial complexity involved in actually operationalizing this reserve. From legal questions about authority to transfer Bitcoin between agencies, to technical questions about custody infrastructure, to policy questions about valuation methodologies and accounting treatment of these holdings in government financial statements. The timing of the $15 billion Prince Group seizure shortly after the reserve announcement created what some observers characterized as a test case for how the administration's Bitcoin strategy handles complicated scenarios involving assets connected to serious crimes, national security concerns, and international law enforcement cooperation, because simply adding this Bitcoin to the reserve is straightforward from a custody perspective, but raises questions about whether assets derived from particularly egregious criminal enterprises should be handled differently from more routine seizures. What remains unclear is how subsequent administrations will treat this reserve, because executive orders can be revoked by future presidents just as Trump revoked previous digital asset policies. And without legislation passed by Congress that gives the reserve statutory foundation, it exists in a more precarious political position where changing political priorities could lead to its dissolution or transformation, though the Bitcoin Act, if passed, would provide that legislative foundation and make the reserve more permanent. The self-custody emphasis in Trump's broader digital asset policy framework represents an important counterweight to fears about eventual confiscation, because by explicitly supporting the right of individuals to hold their own private keys rather than keeping cryptocurrency on exchanges or with custodians, the policy acknowledges that one of Bitcoin's fundamental value propositions is resistance to seizure or control, and undermining that property would damage both the asset's utility and the domestic crypto industry that the administration aims to support. The practical reality is that while the government can relatively easily seize Bitcoin held on exchanges or with custodians who comply with legal orders, Bitcoin held in proper self-custody with secure private key management is essentially unconfiscatable unless the holder voluntarily surrenders access, because the cryptographic security that protects Bitcoin from unauthorized access protects it equally from government seizure, unless the government can compel the holder to provide private keys, which creates constitutional questions about self-incrimination and limits on compelled testimony. This technical resistance to confiscation distinguishes Bitcoin from gold in 1933, because while Roosevelt could threaten fines and imprisonment to compel gold surrender and could search homes and safe deposit boxes to find physical gold, Bitcoin properly stored leaves no physical trace and no way for authorities to access it without the holder's cooperation, making any confiscation attempt far more practically difficult, even if legal authority existed. The strategic reserve policy therefore exists in tension with these technical realities, because the government can accumulate Bitcoin through seizures from criminals who kept poor operational security or stored assets on exchanges, and can hold that Bitcoin indefinitely as a reserve asset, but cannot practically extend that control to the broader Bitcoin ecosystem without fundamentally compromising the properties that make Bitcoin valuable in the first place. The economic argument for the reserve rests partly on the opportunity cost calculation that selling seized Bitcoin has historically proven to be poor timing, because the government typically auctions these assets relatively soon after seizure at whatever the market price happens to be, and then watches as Bitcoin appreciates to much higher levels in subsequent years, meaning that holding rather than selling could generate substantial paper gains that strengthen the government's balance sheet, even if that value is not immediately realized through sales. Whether Bitcoin ultimately succeeds as a long-term store of value comparable to gold or fails as a speculative bubble that eventually collapses remains genuinely uncertain despite strong opinions on both sides, and the government's decision to establish a strategic reserve represents a substantial bet on the former outcome, or at least a hedging strategy that recognizes the potential upside while accepting the downside risks if Bitcoin's value deteriorates significantly. The geopolitical game theory becomes interesting when considering how other nations respond to the US establishing this reserve, because if major economies all rush to accumulate Bitcoin, this could drive prices substantially higher and potentially create supply scarcity that increases volatility and market dysfunction. But if most other nations decline to follow suit and continue treating Bitcoin as a speculative asset rather than a reserve asset, then the US position becomes more isolated and potentially more vulnerable to criticism about inappropriate use of government resources. The underlying question that the strategic reserve policy forces into public debate is what gives money value and what role government backing plays in that value, because traditional fiat currency derives value from government decree and acceptance for tax payments, gold derives value from physical scarcity and historical precedent, and Bitcoin claims to derive value from mathematical scarcity and decentralized consensus, and by treating Bitcoin as a reserve asset worthy of government custody, the US government implicitly acknowledges that Bitcoin has value independent of government issuance, which represents a conceptual shift in monetary thinking. The title circulating in some corners of the internet about Trump's Bitcoin executive order revealing hidden confiscation plans appears to be misleading sensationalism rather than accurate characterization of the policy, because while the order certainly expands government involvement in cryptocurrency markets and creates institutional infrastructure for managing digital assets, nothing in the actual text or implementation suggests confiscation of private holdings, and the emphasis on self-custody protection points in the opposite direction. That said, the legitimate concerns about government overreach, the historical precedent of gold confiscation, and the technical possibility that future policy changes could attempt something more aggressive all warrant ongoing attention from anyone holding significant cryptocurrency, because political environments change, emergencies create justifications for extraordinary measures, and the legal frameworks that currently protect private property rights could be tested if severe economic or national security crises emerge. The most prudent approach for individuals concerned about these risks remains maintaining genuine self-custody with secure private key management, avoiding concentration of holdings on exchanges, or with third-party custodians who could be compelled to freeze or surrender assets, and staying informed about policy developments that could signal shifting attitudes toward cryptocurrency regulation. Because while current policy explicitly supports private cryptocurrency ownership and usage, the durability of that policy across different administrations and political contexts remains to be established through time and experience.